Thank you, everyone. Let me first introduce first speaker, Christine O'Keefe. She will be speaking on measuring risk and utility in remote analysis and online data centers. Why isn't this problem already solved?
Thanks very much, Robin. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank the organisers for putting on this fabulous program and bringing us together to think about some of these problems. So what I'm trying to do today is really ask questions. So I hope I'm going to ask more questions than not in this talk. I'm going to come from a practical perspective. I want to solve problems that are real and of interest to practitioners, to statistical agencies, and increasingly other agencies and data custodians looking to make their data available for research and other purposes. But looking for those bridges to the more theoretical work and how can we get more formal in what we're doing. So I'll talk a little bit about just making data available for research and give a bit of an overview. It's a kind of personal perspective, and looking at then focusing, I guess, on risk and utility measures. That it has become actually quite a small part of the talk, but it is still there. And I'll close with some remarks and hopefully some questions for future research. So basically the way that people have been thinking about making data available for research is about this balancing risk and utility. So people have seen this sort of idea before, where the idea is to decide on your maximum tolerable risk and then create, if your original data has risk above that maximum tolerable, then somehow redact it to some released data set that's hopefully going to give you the best utility you can gain while staying below that maximum tolerable risk threshold. So the types of ways that people have been making data available for research, first idea is to treat the data. So we've heard about this already yesterday, where we've got microdata confidentialization techniques, synthetic data. And if you were to perhaps think about where these various initiatives might fit on the risk and utility curve, that's the wrong button, kind of a view of whereabouts they might be. Secure data centers, we've also heard about. You actually go to the center and you use pink paper so they can tell if you're taking anything away and this sort of stuff that you're working on. So there, on the top two, you're working on pretty original data under strict conditions. With public use files, synthetic data, you've got heavily modified data or modified data and less controls. So if you want to think about that as a paradigm, confidentialize, then analyze, and obviously your analysis, as we've been talking about, has to take into account the confidentialization processes. In the middle then, you've got a couple of other approaches, virtual data centers and remote analysis servers. I have to say actually there isn't a common terminology for these. Sometimes you'll hear them called online data centers, data enclaves, this sort of thing, but I'll be saying virtual data center and remote analysis server because I want a virtual data center is really, you can think of it as a virtual secure data center. So, and they kind of fill up the middle, which is quite nice, so that you've got a coverage. And one of the things I believe is that it's really important to have a lot of different approaches to making data available for research, because there's a lot of different scenarios, different types of data, types of users, types of purposes. So we need to have a range to choose from. We're not going to find one approach that does everything for us. These two also have the benefit that you're analysing more or less the real data and then doing some confidentiality process on the output, which conceptually in some situations is quite appealing. But I go back to the point that I think we need all the approaches, and understanding when they're applicable is really important. So I'll talk a little bit more then about remote analysis and virtual data centers. So we've got a user who makes a query of some data. Now normally this is curated through a software interface. Some output is produced and this goes back to the user. Now it's not quite that simple. In a remote analysis server, that barrier there is opaque. So the user cannot see the data, can't interact directly with the data. They can just shoot queries in and get responses back. Okay? It's very restrictive. In a virtual data center, the interface is transparent. The user can see the data, interact directly with the data, and receive outputs. Okay? So that's an important difference because, of course, in a remote analysis server, you have to protect the data against the user as well as against malicious intruders. Whereas in a virtual data center, you don't need to protect the data against the user because they can already see the data. Sometimes manual output checking is added, particularly in virtual data centers. And a response then from the analysis server or the data center would be either suppression of the output, if it's judged to be too risky, or the original output itself, or some redacted or confidentialized output. So you can either suppress, give the actual answer, or give some confidentialized redacted version of that. Okay, so these have been around in the literature for about just over 10 years in one form or another. So I'll talk a little bit about remote servers. I didn't mention that questions are, of course, welcome. I thought we were taking that for granted. I spent a long time thinking about how to present this talk. It became, initially I had in my mind, oh, I'll just give you a survey of all the risk and utility measures. But that turns out not to be very useful. And it's much more useful to think about how to think about it. So that's what I'm trying to do today, is to talk about how to think about the problem, or how I have found. So I've found it useful to separate table servers from analysis servers. It's an artificial distinction, but I've found it useful because approaches tend to be different. I've also found it useful to separate out non-perturbative. Now, it's a name. It means that you either get the original output or you get a suppression. Okay? So they give you the real answer or nothing. Or there's perturbative where the output is altered and sometimes suppressed, but that's minor. But the output is altered. So it turns out there was a bit of work in the middle 2000s out of NIS on table servers and linear regression servers that were actually this non-perturbative idea. It seems to have disappeared, but that was actually investigated in the mid-2000s. Some of the authors can enlighten us on maybe where it went. And the perturbative, this is the one that's actually continued to be investigated. So for tables, we've got traditional cell suppression, controlled table adjustment, synthetic tables, all of these ideas. And also about the same time, the ABS table builder was invented, adding consistent noise to cells. And I don't actually work too much in tables, but just from the outside, this is the one that seems to be getting the most kind of implementations, if you like. Differentially private algorithms also, of course, fit into the remote server, table server paradigm. And analysis servers, you can add noise to the outputs, add noise to score functions, you can do aggregations, you can give synthetic outputs, and differentially private algorithms, of course, there as well. So that's just a kind of a brief overview of how I've kind of classified them for the purposes of this talk. So I'll talk about the non-perturbative first. As I mentioned, they have kind of, I guess, disappeared, but there was quite a lot of technical work done in the mid-2000s in a couple of examples. So for a table server, imagine you've got a large contingency table sitting behind that curtain, and people can ask for marginal subtables, and they will either get the marginal subtable, original, or they'll get notice that the output's been suppressed. So you're interested in what is the space of answerable queries. And there's two modes in which you can do this. You can either use a static mode, so you can predetermine a set of answerable queries, and I guess you'd try to optimise this in some way, optimising overall utility under some measure, given an upper bound on risk. Okay, so what's the biggest set of tables you can give out? Or you can do it in a dynamic mode where each query is investigated individually, given the previous queries, and that would be based on risk alone. Because of course you're giving out the real data. So the interesting thing here is that we've got a few examples of static mode servers, but the dynamic mode hasn't been, well, I couldn't find anyone that had really investigated that deeply. Oh, that's interesting. Fantastic. I know how to turn it off now. Right. So going on to, yes, those, as I mentioned, just the static ones where you want to determine the largest possible answer space. The sorts of disclosure risk measures that were used were pretty much the things that you would normally imagine. Small cells, cells with dominant contributors, sample uniques. And imagining that you solve the linear equations implied by the subtables, the release subtables, then how close can you reconstruct the original table? That one's probably, I think, the most realistic. The others are more proxy measures, actually. The utility measures are a bit, I think there's room for some work there, because to my mind they're all quite proxy measures of utility. So how many tables you're releasing, number of degrees of freedom, some global measures of accuracy. Okay, so that was the story for those non-perturbative table servers, the ones where you're looking for that maximal answer space. In the case of analysis servers, so in the paper Gomitan, Carr, Reiter and Sunil 2005, only the static mode was looked at, only linear regressions, and in fact quite a special linear regression as well, or quite a special data set, only one sensitive variable, all the others non-sensitive, query spaces, all the linear regressions with response x0, no transformations, fairly typical linear regression output. And again, you're interested in what's the largest answer space. So what's the largest set of those regressions that you can output? Now, why I've given you the details of the setup there is just to point out how kind of specialised that became with a single sensitive variable, and the measures then became quite technical and involved. So I'm not going to give them here. It's very very, very good measures, I think, but quite technical and involved in that special case. So I think generalisability there is a real question if non-perturbative static linear regression servers are seen to have a useful place in the data dissemination landscape. So there, the risk measures pretty convincing. I think again the utility measures are somewhat proxy in nature. Okay, so I'll move on to the perturbative. So these are the ones that perhaps have had more attention over the last 10 years. For tables, there's been a lot of interest, a lot of work in understanding what the attacks are on tables in order to design the protections. So the most important ones being averaging and differencing, sparsity, and comparing tabular output with public use files as well. And in fact, there's two sort of types of attacks on tables. One's to do with the scope, which is, these slip in and out of me being able to explain what they are. So perhaps it's better if you read them. But you have to look at both the coverage of queries, which is the set of entities that are involved in that query, and the logical meaning of the query. So if you've got a random seed and you're not fixing it, then you're vulnerable to additive attacks. Okay? So I did want to mention in particular the ABS table builder software, because I've noticed it getting more and more attention around the world. So the idea is for any table, you do a procedure on each cell to confidentialize or redact or anonymize it. And the procedure is as follows, or this is kind of a stylized version. It's more or less what they do. The actuality is a bit more complex, but the additional complexity doesn't really add anything. So you first determine what are the contributors to that cell, x1 to xn, and each contributor in the background has associated with it a key, a persistent key, enduring key. So those contributors have keys k1 to kn. You add them up, okay? You have a lookup table. Depending on your cell value and the value of the key, you get a perturbation P. You add that to the cell and do that for all the table, and then in the end, because you've probably destroyed additivity, you can choose whether you restore the additivity or not. Apparently users don't mind tables that aren't additive, so they generally don't. So this is very, very nice because it protects against differencing. You know, whenever you have the same entities in a cell, you get the same perturbation, no matter what table is asked for across all requests. Okay, and then measures of risk and utility. There was a great investigation by Jennifer Marley and Victoria Lever with some beautiful maps of risk and utility. So the interesting thing is these don't look like the traditional. I think they might have them switched around the other way, but they're the risk utility maps for the table builder outputs. Again, somewhat of a proxy nature on those table counts. Okay. I've found a couple of other suggestions for disclosure risk measures on tables that weren't actually investigated in that ABS study. But the point is, really, what are you trying to capture with your disclosure risk measures and with your data utility measures? Okay. In the case of cell suppression that I haven't really talked about, but this is suppressing sensitive cells or small count cells usually, and cells with dominant contributors, and then secondary cell suppression to prevent reconstruction. Those are some of the disclosure risk measures that have been suggested for those. You can see why I decided to move away from surveying disclosure risk measures and utility measures. So I'll talk a little bit then about analysis servers, remote analysis servers. And the problem's really quite hard. You know, we've been thinking about it for a long time, and we've really only got good ideas in linear regression, and then we say, oh, of course it generalizes to other analyses, but we haven't actually followed through those analyses in most cases. In some papers we've looked at generalized additive models, but typically we've stayed with linear regression. So the idea then with linear regression, thinking about what are the sort of attacks that might be relevant, reconstructing from estimates and residuals, perturbation averaging, looking at outliers. So if there are outliers, the unusual response variable value increases re-identified risk. Influential points. If you've got an influential point in your data set, then it will pull the regression line to it, have a small residual, and therefore your estimates are very close to the true value, which can be a disclosure problem. There are also transformations you can do on data that produce influential points. So you actually need to think about restricting transformations as well, or solving your model equations. So how do we think about like protecting linear regression outputs? You can add noise to the estimates. But this is actually quite a difficult thing to do. It's hard to determine sometimes how much noise to add and to the different components of the estimated vectors, and you can get inconsistent estimators out of that. So more recently, looking at adding noise to the score function, and we saw an example of that yesterday. But this is also I think a good way to go, particularly for linear regression. If you're protecting the score function, you're protecting the sufficient statistics for the estimates anyway, so why would you protect the estimates themselves? For diagnostics, the idea with diagnostics is not to release the individual values. So the ABS has recently, in their data analyzer remote analysis server, have been producing kind of heat maps. Other ideas have been synthetic, as we've seen, or parallel box plots. So just grouping your residuals can give really great information. So if that's the original residuals, this would be a synthetic version, and that's actually some parallel box plots, or you can try your heat map type of idea. But grouping the residuals seems to be quite protective against releasing an individual value. Of course, you have to watch out that you don't have too few observations in any of the bins, so you do have your tabular confidentiality problem as well when you're looking at your group residuals. So looking at estimates, what are the sorts of measures for risk and utility people are using? Kind of, again, a couple of sort of proxy measures. Obviously, the probability of re-identification of a respondent under certain assumptions, yeah, that's really what you want, but there's very few people that have actually had a go at doing that in a real situation or proposing how that might be done with linkage studies and so on. Utility measures, so there's more utility measures. And it's typically looking at the difference between the accuracy of the inferences on the perturb and the original output. Now, I think I make this point later in the presentation, but I'll talk about it now because it's kind of pertinent. When you've got a microdata set, then getting a handle on disclosure risk is, I think, relatively straightforward. You try linkage attacks, okay? You've got the data set and you go off and you try the linkage attacks, which is pretty much what your attacker would do. It's utility that's hard to measure because you don't know what the user's going to do with the data. In a remote analysis server, I propose it's kind of the other way around. You do know what the user is doing with the data because they've given you their analysis request. So you know how to measure utility, where to focus when you're measuring utility. It's disclosure risk that's kind of harder because you get an analysis output, and how do you measure the disclosure risk of an analysis output? So I'll give you an idea. I've got an idea about that, which I'll talk about later. But I think that's really why, in a sense, the risk measures here are few and the utility measures are many, because you know what the analyst is trying to do. Group diagnostics, yeah, we had a go a few years ago. We can probably do better now if we think about these things again. How would you measure disclosure risk and utility for diagnostics? Oh yes, so here we go. Let's think about how you might measure disclosure risk. So you've got your remote analysis server, you're shooting in queries, you're getting responses, and I'm going to suppose, I guess really, that you're getting actually altered output. So I'm not in the non-perturbative situation. So the idea is that the analyst has this output. What do? They actually use that output to try to reconstruct the data set. Okay? So if it's, suppose they've asked for the mean, then in the absence of no other information, they would guess that the data set, every value in the data set was that value of the mean, right? Or if they knew it was heights of people, they'd say, oh, I know that's normal, so I'm going to have a guess at the variance and use a normal curve. So what they would do is use that output, however small it is, to reconstruct or estimate or synthesize a data set, and then you're in the situation of measuring the disclosure risk between a real data set and a synthetic, reconstructed, estimated data set. Unfortunately, there weren't any disclosure risk measures for fully synthetic data sets I could find, so we've had to kind of do some other ideas there. But I do wonder whether that's perhaps one way to start approaching the problem, because disclosure risk for data sets is easier than for analysis output. Anyway, so I wanted to move on. I promised to talk a little bit about, as well, virtual data centres. So I want to talk a bit then about virtual data centres. They're just like remote analysis, except the boundary between you and the data is opaque, so you can see the data, you can do whatever you want. There's no restrictions at all. There's only a restriction on, well, there may be only a restriction on what comes out. So we did a piece of work for the Population Health Research Network, who wanted to build a virtual data centre for administrative health data. And they were interested in population health and health services research and what were relevant disclosure risks and how could they kind of prevent them. So we did a piece of work and looked at what were the main disclosure risks in statistical output. And it turns out there's a bit of a short list, really. Obviously, if you release a data value, that's not good. Small cells, small samples, dominance of one entity in the data set, differencing linear or other algebraic relationships in the data, and precision of outputs. So we came up, so they proposed to us that they wanted to build a virtual data centre, and they didn't want to have manual output checking, okay? Because it's too expensive to have your experts sitting around checking outputs for hundreds of researchers. It doesn't scale. So they said, look, can we do something else? So we came up with a proposal which is a two-stage process. The data set there's some preparation of the data set. Typically it's aggregating dates and geography, the two most disclosive types of variables. So some light data set preparation before it goes into the virtual data centre. And then you can either, so suppression of output through manual output checking, well, they didn't want that. So they said, well, what about if we get the user to confidentialise their own outputs? And we said, oh, well, okay, we can have a go. Because if you look at some of these output guides, of Stats New Zealand, and there's one from the European Union as well, they're quite complex and really written for the expert. So we said, okay, we'll have a go at producing some guidelines, or guidelines for a user to confidentialise their own outputs. And they said, Yes, and could it eventually be automatable, please? So we did actually prepare a checklist of tests for use by researchers, and it's targeted to public health and health services researchers. So that helped a lot, okay, so because we could narrow the field and we could narrow to the sorts of outputs that they were producing. And we took those disclosure risks and tried to kind of put them into tests that people could read and understand, and then we produced an output of, saying, a table, so the user could go, okay, I want to publish a mean, these are the tests I have to look at, I have to make sure that it's got enough, you know, it's a mean over enough participants, I have to make sure nobody's dominating, I have to make sure that I'm not getting means over two different populations. And then, of course, if the output fails one of these tests, it tells you what to do, gives you some options about how to avoid that. Yes, Cynthia.
Can I try to abstract the model for a moment? And
Yeah.
Okay, if you wouldn't mind going back a slide?
Sure.
Oops, yeah, that one. So if I understand, what you're saying is there's a little bit of pre-processing that's done on the data, roughly speaking, to hide things like geography and one other.
Dates.
Then, in some sense, the user is trusted
Yes.
to have access to that lightly pre-processed data.
Yes.
And now the user does a bunch of calculations and
Yes.
computations and decides certain things are interesting or important and publishes those things. But the user now does some kind of operation
Yeah.
before, say, releasing some tables or the results of certain computations. The user does some operation in order to ensure privacy at that point.
That's right. Yes. Thanks very much for your question, because I didn't explain it very well, or at all.
You did fine. I was just putting it into my language.
Yeah, the user would like to publish a paper in the academic literature, and they want to make sure that they're not publishing any information that could lead to the re-identification or attribute disclosure for people in the data. Yes. So it's only at the point of preparing a paper for publication that they would need to redact the output.
Right. And the issue from our perspective is that even the choice of what to publish could reveal something about somebody in the data set. Like the fact that they decided to publish a linear regression rather than a table could actually reveal something, at least in theory.
Yeah.
We have a name for this. We call it the Feinberg problem.
Yep.
So the idea is we trust Feinberg completely.
Yep.
And can he sort of have a go at the data, and then before he publishes his conclusions, do something to make sure that it preserves privacy?
Yes.
It's a theoretically extremely challenging question, and we should talk about some like play solutions that we have to it.
Yeah, definitely, because this is happening now, you know, and
In economics, that's called the Raj-Chetty problem.
great. Okay, so
We also have a lazy Feinberg variation, so yes.
there are a couple of additional twinkles, I suppose, in this problem, and one is that currently the network is giving the data to the user, the whole data set, right? And then they ask for a copy of the publication, but there's no kind of intermediate, correspondence. So, yeah, how are users doing now? And also, the other point I was going to make that I have forgotten.
There's another point, of course, that the researchers are all, assessed, and they go through a process. They sign a contract, sign their life away, and so there's some sort of security that way as well.
They go through
Here's
it.
a question that comes up in the American audience. Suppose the researcher is in fact a lawyer for a class action lawsuit who is trying to find out about some kind of exposure to a chemical or whatever. Lawyer is totally actually trustworthy, except the lawyer has an obligation to represent the client to the best of his or her ability. And confidentiality is not the top priority for the lawyer.
In this, in our situation,
Wouldn't get access.
yeah, well, I'm going to talk about this in just a moment. But in this situation, yeah, the projects are approved by the custodians and by ethical review. So they're all bona fide researchers in this situation.
But it's not necessarily unethical to
They're public health and
to make
But
class
they
action.
have to sign a disclaimer saying they won't do certain things,
Yeah.
like identify individuals.
Yeah.
Even a lawyer would have to agree to that, surely.
Yeah, they do. They sign agreements. So, but I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment. But one interesting thing was, once we'd made the checklist, we kind of Tim Churches asked the question, so how well are public health researchers doing now? So we went off and got 6 of us to review a whole bunch of papers from PubMed, and we used the checklist to see, how people were doing, and they were doing extremely well. So they're really, it was fantastic how they were doing. And interestingly, there was very good agreement across the reviewers as well, some of whom had never seen the project or public health research before. So we're quite confident that the table's relatively robust. The researchers also get the training. This is an important point too. Trained researchers. So I want to make 10 minutes of remarks in order to stop at time. So what's happening out there? So when I was preparing this talk, I went and chatted with an unnamed national statistical agency, and I gleaned some kind of insights from them that we've written up in a little paper too. So this is quite a traditional way to think about risk. Yeah, the probability you're going to get a disclosure is the probability of an attempt times the probability that it's successful, and you add up over all the possible types of attempts. And this has been like what, 30 years on the go, and it's still relevant, right? But people have started talking about the 5 safes. So I don't know who's heard of the 5 safes. Yeah, it's a terrible name, but unfortunately, I think it's going to stick. And the 5 safes is really looking at confidentiality protection overall, making sure the project is appropriate, the user is appropriate, the setting is appropriate, the data are appropriate, and the output are appropriate. So think of this as like a set of sliders. They don't have to all be on max in order to have protection. Like if your data are safe, are protected, then everything else, you don't need to protect if you've got 0 risk coming out of the data, for example. So this is actually gaining a lot of traction. It is closely related to the Marsh et al. Framework. Assuring your project is appropriate is a different matter, and that's what you're getting to there, Cynthia. So in health services anyway, in population health research, it's taken care of by ethical review, custodial review. But in the broader setting, that's a really great question. Making sure that you're looking at your user, registering, getting a relationship with them, training, or are they a member of the public? Is it a virtual data centre? Is it a public use file? The data, again, how protected is that? How protected is the output? And all of those things then come together to give you an overall. So just to give you a couple of examples, this is the one that we were working on that I was talking about before with the checklist, the Secure Unified Research Environment Virtual Data Centre. They said, okay, we've got a community of trained users, so the likelihood they're going to do something bad is very low. Projects are approved and have ethical review. Likelihood of something going wrong is very low. We've got very detailed data, so the likelihood of something going wrong in the data is actually very high, okay. And self-checking of outputs, well, actually I haven't put anything there. Oh yeah, because that was the design of it, right? And the suggestion was then, okay, so use the virtual data centre, because you trust your users and projects, and self-checking of outputs brings that down low as well to give you a low overall. So that's the kind of idea. It's a bit like the Swiss cheese. You just make sure that all your holes don't line up. You've got high protection in some areas. So public use files, broad range of users, no control over projects, no control in the settings. So all of these are very high. So you better make sure that you get these two pretty low to get your overall risk low. So I think this is something for us in this program to have a go at thinking about as well, because it's definitely gaining traction in the real world. Okay, so getting on to some of those remarks. Where are all the remote analysis servers? They've been in the literature for 10 years. The ABS has a prototype data analyzer, but as far as I know, no plans to productize it. The USCB microdata access system, I'd love to know what's happened there. It sort of disappeared from the literature.
It was taken down, and the experiments to create a successor have been cancelled.
That's more or less what happened in another unnamed, statistical agency as well. So,
Did you hear what that was? Are there concerns about confidentiality?
Yes.
and utility, people analysts hate them because they can't see through the.
I think it would be appropriate to conclude that nobody was very happy with it.
Nobody likes, except the researchers. We loved it, But I've got to find a new career. Virtual data
The U.S. didn't love it because they had a difficult time figuring out whether their model was going to be allowed through.
Yeah. But on the other hand, virtual data centers are proliferating. I've seen a lot of these guys in between here and where I'm living, actually.
We had the first one at Cornell, ahead of all of those.
Yeah, thank you. I'll get a reference from you later, because I can't keep up, actually. They're proliferating. So we've got to pay attention, I think, to virtual data centers. And, that experimentation with training users to confidentialise their own output is perhaps a nice way to start to get around the scalability of the output checking. ABS actually are adopting this approach now as well for more general outputs than public health. So I think there's a clear direction there for us to do some work looking at. Oh, the other interesting thing, people try searching for an image on Trump. It was very frustrating. This is another kind of insight that's been given to me by the unnamed statistical agency down the road. The data linkage or integration landscape is broadening. So it has been health research up until now. Basically, everyone now wants to get in on the act. At least in Australia, all of the government agencies are starting to say, "Oh my God, I've got this, gold mine of data. If I can link everyone else's data to mine, they will add value, and I can do all these wonderful things." Of course, nobody wants to give their data to anyone else, but that's another story. And as soon as they link it, of course, they go, "Oh, well, we linked it in order to fulfill this requirement of the tax office, but actually we could use it to identify vulnerable people to better target our," so there's this scope creep happening as well. So here are some examples of some of the challenges that are coming from this broadening. And I think a really interesting one is this enduring data set. So I was trying to dig in on this in the last couple of days. Are we linking to keep as an enduring, or are we, bring together and destroy? So you want unrestricted exploratory data analysis. So people don't know what they want from the data often before they start. How can they get ethical review? What sort of outputs are you going to release? Your trusted community of trained researchers is going to explode. Commercially sensitive information, so your data reveals things about my data, so you better be careful about what you publish, right? Because I care. Scalable access settings, so how are we going to address that? How do we manage the whole idea of confidentialising outputs for different purposes? policy advice, reporting, service provision, as well as research, because we've all been kind of in the research paradigms shifting, changing. And what we're seeing, at least in Australia, is there's more emphasis on governance. So who's taking responsibility for decision making? And there's this proliferation of relationships and agreements happening where people are getting together and doing an ad hoc pilot, you know, and everyone's got different ideas about how it's going to pan out in the end. Public acceptability is also becoming really much more important. The public are much more informed and aware in the digital age, and they want to know what are we doing with their data and why, and what's happening, how we protecting it. So I think there's an opportunity to rethink relationship with the public, and at least in Australia. So I know the Australian examples, but there's a policy for consumer involvement in health research. So if you're a health researcher, you need to get some members of the public to actually help you in designing your research questions even, right? This is fantastic. And some other arguments. Trust is cheaper than technology. Data utility is not graded. Technical solutions breed further technical problems. So if you build a remote analysis server, you have to develop new algorithms, specialized techniques, you have to update it, you have to maintain it, new versions, different software. So people, at least in the world I'm aware of, are starting to go, well, actually trust in a lot of situations is going to trump technology. It's cheaper. So I've got some questions then for further research. And some of them are about the context and the practical application. So these are kind of framing questions for the research problems. What's the future of table servers? Is that table builder paradigm going to dominate? Actually, Robin, there's only 1 minute, but thank you for giving me 5. What's the future of remote analysis servers? You know, replaced by virtual data centres? If so, who will be responsible for ensuring confidentiality is protected? How best to manage users of different trust levels, different communities of users? What's the logical consequence of the trust trumps technology? Are we going to have this landscape of overlapping coalitions? And imagine the amount of expertise that has to be out there if every agency is going to be running its own linkage and integration and data dissemination service, or will there be one agency to rule them all? And who should it be? Some of these are the old chestnuts, okay? So we need to think again, I think, in that context about what are the basic questions about disclosure risk and utility. How do we formalise the questions? How can we formally measure and balance risk and utility? I'm very convinced that we will be asked by the public even, not only by the lawmakers, to get more formal about this. What about multiple interacting queries? It's typically one that statistical disclosure controls has dodged until now. Typically, there are some exceptions. How do we incorporate domain knowledge in a principled manner into risk and utility measurements? So at the minute we don't distinguish between different data set types of data sets, different variables, auxiliary information. We kind of treat everything the same. The other really interesting thing that we do is we use disclosure risk measures in 2 different ways. So we use them to decide what to redact, and we use them to understand whether a redacted output is safe to release or not. And I think those 2 things are different. So I think we could usefully separate those 2 and get more pointy about each of them separately. More questions. So I'm also really interested in what's the connection with data linkage. What if the data set arose from linking separate data sets? So at the minute we kind of typically ignore that in confidentiality. We just say, oh, there's more variables, therefore it's more risky. But is there actually something more there? How does it change risk utility characteristics and measurement? How does the linkage inform risk and utility measurement? How can we take ideas from differential privacy? And when you're linking multiple data sets, and we talk about chains, they're really graphs, of course, because you can look at them pairwise. Okay, so the other thing we need, we desperate need for standard terminology. Yeah. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, time for a few. Well, thank you very much for keeping to time. So we have time for quite a few potentially questions, comments. So
Yes.
yeah.
Could you go back to 2 or 3 slides? The last comment you made about the need for 2 different types. Could you elaborate what you mean by that? Right, because you could imagine that I have a data set, I decide if I need to change something, I change it, and then I'm sort of back to the same first question. So what do you see the 2 different types of measures?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of the reason it's a question is that I don't actually really quite know the answer.
Okay.
So let's think about it some more, Anne-Sophie. I mean, it just seemed to me that those 2 things are different, right? But we're using the same measures.
Right, it just seems like it would be weird to say I need to change this and then change it, but then we go back and we say, oh, it's not okay, we can't publish it. Right?
Yeah. Mark's going to help, are you?
Well, it's just it depends on what disclosure control techniques you've used in between times. If you preserve data at all, then there's a whole range of risk measures which don't work because they're based on distributions and therefore they're then as soon as you perturb something, you're creating a perturbation of the distribution by definition, which, for example, throws up outliers which are not real outliers, but look like they're risky records. So you need to at least adjust your risk measures to take into account of the disclosure control that you apply.
I've actually thought of a counterexample of that as well, because so when you're in Table Builder, say, you I haven't thought of a counterexample. But yeah, I just think it's something to think about. Yeah.
John.
So I've always thought that the ABS table builder is the most sophisticated thing out there that could, with, I think, not very much adjustment, be made formally private, whether you use the differential privacy paradigm or one that's a slight generalization of it. And I'm wondering why that hasn't happened, because it seems like a natural step. Do you have any idea?
It is formally private. They use a perturbation matrix.
Oh, I mean
There's
by,
no zeros in
I
there.
mean by that
Yeah,
you have
like some sort of probabilistic guarantee.
with the
Yeah.
phase factor. That's
Look,
what
I think you know, if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably just time constraint of being able to think about it enough. So I don't think there's a structural barrier.
I've looked and can't find this answer, but I think it's public. The distribution that's used to perturb the cell values.
Well, that's secret.
There's a lookup table,
But
and that is
there's,
secret.
I think the variance of it is known.
But-
So
Does not mean zero.
Has to be mean.
Well, no, it isn't.
It doesn't have to be anything. It is.
I hit all the.
It's not. It's a perturbation matrix, but it's not. Adjusted so that the margins are fixed. They have to do some sort of fiddling with the margins
Well, it's an iterative proportion.
I only showed.
The noise or after they generate the noise?
after the generation.
Well, after they generate the noise is okay.
I only showed the categorical version. In the continuous version, the perturbation actually consists of a direction and an amount and something else. So they can't actually. It's not a simple distribution generated noise.
But it is private,
The
confidential.
table is secret. Yes, that's the protection part.
But I think they do disseminate the variance of this perturbation matrix. Oh,
I don't know.
I couldn't find it. I'm not disputing the claim.
Okay, so that's a really good idea, I think. Yeah.
I take it back to one of the earlier, you don't need to go back to the slide, but you were talking about your experience with the public health researchers
Yeah.
trying to define risky things. Now, we've just been through a similar discussion recently in the context of us trying to synthesize some health data. And when we had an informal discussion with the people responsible for information governance, one of the things they brought out was that certain data and data categories were very much more sensitive than others. And the example was a diagnosis of a secondary diagnosis showing that you were a drug user. And I don't think you had any kind of way in which particular variables or categories of variables could be marked as excess risk. Was that something you ever thought about?
My sense, so we were sticking with the statistical side, so that I think would be covered through the ethical review and the recommend.
You have to think about what's the risk you would in your sample get 3 people with this characteristic. It wouldn't matter if you got 3 people with, some other rare disease which wasn't of any particular, which wasn't nobody was going to worry about.
Yeah, sensitivity of the information. No, that's quite right. No, the main, well, in fact, there were small cells published, but typically what was published weren't quasi-identifiers. You couldn't actually match to any other data sets, so there wasn't a problem. The place where we did find a problem was that people often described the study in some detail. They said it was a study from this area in these dates with women that were 6 weeks postpartum, it was quite, and then they'd say, we found an outlier, and it was this and this, and then you go, oh, yeah, they describe outliers, which, no, good point, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the risk utility graph, it's fairly standard, but I think there is a third dimension, it's not a joke, of impact. I think that comes back to Julian's question. Because we had lots of census tables where you could perhaps find an attribute disclosure, work out that the person who was 25 to 29 and had 4 cars was male, and we didn't find that to be particularly important, given that we've done some record swapping and there was some uncertainty. But if you, on the other hand, could find out somebody had a long-term illness, we'd say that was sensitive. And there are a number of variables in our legislation, the Data Protection Act, that are clearly sensitive, and so we do take that distinction.
Yeah,
it's not straightforward.
Yeah. Okay, so I didn't give the full detail there, but the table, that kind of risk evaluation table was the first. We say that's the first step, and then if you identify anything that's a risk identified as a risk here, then think about whether it's actually disclosed or not. So I guess that's covered in the second step. Think about whether it's actually a problem. Yeah.
So I think that some of the discussion is highlighting on the fact that there really are two issues with disclosure risk that we should think about. One is harm, and the other is actual risk that something is disclosed, right? And Chris has a nice paper where he talks about harm versus disclosure risk, because the disclosure risk is just the chance that something is learned. And whether it's harmful or not is a separate decision. And the laws don't talk about harm because it's hard to think about, but maybe we should start thinking more about harm. This is connected to some of the things that I mentioned at the end about identification versus attribute. So, I have a long email to you, Penn, Cynthia, but
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
But I mean, whether I participated in the American Community Survey or not, I mean, is that a real harm? I mean,
Can't be a harm.
Depends on your anti-tax
it's required by law. But that's my point. Is that a harm? But what is a harm potentially if someone learns my income, or something like that? And so, but the law says I have to. Just the fact that I'm in the survey has to be. Or not in the survey, has to be protected.
It's because if you're in a survey and you tell somebody in your survey, I can probably find you with 2 or 3 variables. Quasi-identifiers.
And then you find everything else.
Yeah, and then I find everything else.
So the thing about the
So
harm.
that's attribute disclosure.
So the thing about the harm thing
Generalize
is
that
that
there's 1 in 5 households are in the survey, and therefore, if I just start guessing, I'm going to be able to find almost anybody.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm talking about.
So sometimes I think that with harm, for example, if someone learned that I didn't have a criminal record, I'm happy, I don't care. But if you do some perturbation or some synthesis, and then someone learns incorrectly that I have a criminal record, that's really bad. So they've got it wrong, but I'd rather they learn the correct thing. So I think, so sometimes, I mean, I don't know, like you can do more harm by protecting data in some ways, maybe.
So the last time I had to fill out a security clearance, after I filled it out, I bought everything that Checkmate had on me to see what could be learned about me that I hadn't declared on the security clearance, and I was okay with what it found. But my point is, I had no control over what's in Checkmate.
What is checkmate?
Oh, that's probably the biggest individual aggregator in the U.S. That they will give you, for the price of a simple enrollment, they'll pass through every so-called public database, the other things that they've managed to acquire, and tell you what they found, your criminal record, where you've lived, any evidence that they have that you have traveled, the things. And then if you start paying premiums, they'll go into things that are harder to access. If you haven't done it on yourself, it's probably worth the $20.
Okay, we've come to the sort of morning coffee time, so if there's nothing, burning comments or questions left, then can leave that for the wrap up maybe, and thank Christine again, so thank you very much.
Thank you.